because I already know that I'm going to be judged. But I love y'all. Thank you, Teron. It was in January, as a matter of fact, 2006. Some of you in the room may not have been born, and I just realized that. It was one of my favorite players of all time, absolute favorite NBA players of all time. And he scored 81 points in a single game, and at that time, he had set a modern NBA record. I had NBA League Pass at the time. It was a televised game. And during that time in my life, in 2006, I almost never missed a game, especially a Laker game. But I fell asleep. And I woke up to the whole sports world on fire. Highlights everywhere, commentators talking about it. Folk was losing their mind, and everybody was texting me and asking me, did you see it? And I'm sitting there thinking, no, I missed it. I want to ask y'all, how about y'all? How many saw that game live? Got one person? Wow. 2 people maybe? So y'all missed it too. And of course, most of us heard about this song. This game. I saw it later. I looked at all of the highlights, but it hits a little different when you don't catch it in real time. It hits a little bit different when you are in the conversation that everybody's having, but you really know you didn't see it. Anybody ever felt that before? Felt like you're supposed to know about something that happened. You're supposed to engage in conversation about something that's happened, but you really missed it? Well, that was me on that moment. And as you'll see, that's another person in God's story that we'll learn about in just a few minutes. So if it's your first time here or your first time in Alone Time, and for all of our people hanging out online, give our online audience a hand and make sure they know that we know that y'all here, even though we can't always see y'all. We know that y'all are present with us. And we want to remind you, everybody, we want to remind you that this is a safe place to struggle, and this is a safe place to be skeptical. As we're continuing in our series, Encounters with Jesus after the resurrection, we want to just remind you, whether you've been following Jesus for a long time, you're just really trying to figure this thing out, we want you to know that you're safe here. You're welcome here. As a matter of fact, I want to remind us here at the Bridge that we want to be the kind of church family that we know that our friends and our family members and our co-workers, they're welcome here with their doubts, their disappointments, their curiosity, and we're all invited together, followers of Jesus, and for those of you who are still unsure, we're all invited to bring all of our concerns, all of our real questions into the presence of Jesus. And here's why that matters. Because when we look at the stories that happen right after the resurrection, these are the people that Jesus encounters, and these are the people who Jesus changes their lives forever. And last week we talked about Mary, and she came and she had this announcement to make to the disciples that she says, I've seen the Lord. She's the first one to see his resurrected body, the first one to receive a message from the resurrected Jesus. And then later on that day, we see that, and this is in John chapter 20, that's where we're at, John chapter 20 and verses 19 through 24. We won't turn there, but in John chapter 20, verses 19 through 24, we see Jesus also came and showed up and presented himself to his disciples on that same day. And when he came, he He spoke peace over their lives, over their fear. They were hiding behind closed doors. And he showed them his hands. He showed them the wounds on his side. And he told them that he was going to be sending them out as messengers of hope. But Thomas, who was one of Jesus' disciples, one of the original 12, he wasn't there. For whatever reason, he was not in the room. And so he missed that moment. He missed the proof. He missed Jesus' presence. And he missed the promise that Jesus had spoken over his brothers. And that's where this tension in this part of the story begins, because everybody is saying to Thomas, first it was Mary, she said, I have seen the Lord. And now here we see his disciples telling Thomas, yo, bro, you missed it. Man, we have seen the Lord. Thomas wasn't there. That's what makes this part of the story so relatable for you and so relatable for me, because we're picking back up. And if you aren't really familiar with the Bible, I just want to let you know that John was one of Jesus' disciples, and he recorded all of this so that you and so that I would believe that Jesus is exactly who he said he was. And so here's what John shows us. He shows us, just like Thomas, just like other people that Jesus encountered after the resurrection, we struggle to believe when we cannot see enough to satisfy our doubts. If I'm being honest, if you're being honest, we struggle to believe when we just don't have enough evidence. Some of us need just a little bit more evidence than others. And some of us know what that feels like. Know what it feels like to hear other people talking about their deep and their transcending prayer life, while you feel like, man, it's a struggle for me to spend 5 minutes in prayer. Or you may currently be in a season of your life where you're just having a drought and you don't have the energy and you don't have the commitment right now to pray on a regular basis. To hear other people talk about how good God is, to hear other people talk about how God is at work in their life and God is at work in their story, and you're still trying to figure out what you actually believe is true. To feel like everybody saw and everybody knows and everybody else is experiencing something that we are not. We somehow miss. And if I'm being honest, I know exactly what that feels like, especially when I enter into academic spaces. And here's why this is so hard for me, because for the last 10 years, I've been formally educated, from master's to a doctorate. For the last 10 years, I've been in these environments where I feel like everybody else in this room knows something that I don't. They've been prepared in ways that I haven't been prepared. They're smarter than me, and I feel like I am missing something. And so I know what it feels like to be struggling, to believe that I know enough, that I'm good enough, that I'm qualified enough, and that I belong. And that's Thomas. He's running up on his brothers, and they're telling them that they saw Jesus, and Thomas is like, man, I ain't going for that. And so here's our question. Here's where we're going to try to keep the most of our time today, is this question. How does Jesus respond to us when we struggle to believe? Struggle to believe that Jesus is alive and active in our lives. Struggle to believe that we are good enough for him. How does Jesus respond to that? And that's a fair question. That's a question I think we all should come back to on a regular and a consistent basis. And here's my sermon in a sentence, just in case we don't get through today, is that Jesus, he welcomes doubters. He invites us to trust and to follow him. And here's the first thing that John shows us, and I think it's really going to be clear as we look at the scripture together. The first thing that John shows us is that doubt grows, it increases, it expands, sometimes even consumes us when we cannot see enough. We want to be hopeful. We want to believe that God is doing something, but we just can't see enough. In our marriages, in our careers, with our children, the people we love, we know that doubt grows when we cannot see enough. And that does not stop when we enter into this room. Sometimes we just don't see Jesus in the ways that we think we ought to. We don't see Jesus in the ways that we hear everybody else around us talking about. And so let's look really quickly at what it says, what John records for us. In verse number 24 in chapter 20, it says, "Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin." By the way, happy birthday to the twins. We got twins that had a birthday this week. Happy birthday to y'all. John, who was one of the 12, called the twin. He was not with them when Jesus came. It goes on to say, so the other disciples told him. They told him that this was their brother. They was excited to give him this good news. They said, "We've seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger in the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side." He said something that was like, this is the guy who was one of Jesus' original 12. He walked with him. He saw Jesus feed the 5,000. He saw Jesus open the eyes of the blind. He saw Jesus call a dead man out of a tomb. But this is what he says. He says, "I will never believe." He don't say, "I'm struggling to believe." He says, "I will never believe." And you can hear it in Thomas. They told him, "We've seen him." And you would think that would have been enough. These aren't strangers. These are people he knows, people who know him, people he trusts, people who trust him. And still, Thomas says, "I ain't going." Thomas says, unless I see, unless I touch, unless I place. Thomas says, "I ain't going. I will never believe." And that's strong language. And that's not Thomas being unsure. That's not Thomas being uncertain. That's Thomas clearly telling him, "I don't care what your mouth say. Unless I see it for myself, I don't believe Jesus is alive." And a matter of fact, y'all keep talking like this. This is what Thomas was thinking. Because these disciples, they were afraid. They were in a room locked away. Jesus had just been publicly crucified. And they were afraid that they were going to eventually get to the rest of his followers. And Thomas is thinking, y'all better cut this foolishness out. Y'all going to mess around and get us killed. And so sometimes we judge Thomas harshly. As a matter of fact, we have a nickname for him in theological circles. We call him Doubting Thomas. Right? As if we would have responded any differently. And this is what doubt does to you. This is what doubt does to us. We're just like Thomas. We're thinking, look, y'all gonna mess around and get us killed. Y'all gonna mess around and get us fired from our job. Y'all gonna mess around and get us. We figured that us professing and proclaiming our faith and living it out in a public way, we feel like it's going to cost us something. And doubt does that to you, and doubt does that to me, because doubt grows in the space. Doubt grows in the gap between what others have seen and what others have said, what your mama have told you about God, what grandmama have told you about God, and what you have really experienced in your life, in your day-to-day experience. And so let us just take a second to pause really quickly before we judge Thomas, because if I'm being honest, we are all more like Thomas than we are not. As a matter of fact, we want to pretend like we are like the other 12 who saying we have seen the Lord, right? But really, we're more like Thomas. There's a famous theologian and pastor, a brilliant writer, and this is what he said. He says, whether your faith is that there is a God or that there is not a God, if you don't have any doubts, you're either kidding yourself or you're asleep. He said, it doesn't matter if you believe or even if you don't believe. Whatever your position is, if you're certain, if you don't have any doubts, he says you're kidding yourself or you're asleep. You probably would say, you lying, right? Because here's what really gets me right here. This is what he reminds us. He says, doubts are the ants in the pants of faith. They see it, awake it, and they keep it moving. And so what he's saying is we all have some uncertainty, and that uncertainty sometimes is what keeps us curious enough to continue pursuing, curious enough to continue praying, curious enough to keep on opening up our eyes and ears to see what it is that God may be doing. And that helps us feel Thomas here. His doubts may not be pretty, but it's honest. He is not really ready to go off of what he has heard. He needs Jesus to meet him for himself. And if we're honest, that's not just Thomas's story, that's our story. Because like I said before, we struggle to believe when we cannot see enough to satisfy our own doubts. And some of us want faith. We want to believe, but we want some guarantees. We want to trust that God is with us. We want to trust that God is able. We want to trust that God is good, and God is good all the time, but we also want it to make sense. We want God sometimes we don't want the miracles because they're confusing to us. And if we're honest, we've never really figured out a good way to explain it to others. And when that doesn't happen, when we don't have the evidence and we can't see it clearly and we can't feel the presence of Jesus, doubt grows. And it's not because we're rebellious. It's not because we just don't have any faith. Sometimes, if we're honest, it's because we're hurting. Sometimes it's because we're disappointed. Sometimes it's because we feel like we've missed something that everybody else seems so sure about. I was talking to a pastor friend, and we were talking about devotion and spending time alone with the Lord. And I was telling him, I said, man, I'm in a season and I'm just struggling. It's like I start my time out, I'm consistent, and before I know it, I'm daydreaming, I'm drifting. I don't even remember what scripture I read the morning for my devotion. And he said, oh man, I'm good. Every morning, I said, how long are you in your and you're spending time with the Lord in the morning? He said, oh, man, at least an hour every day, sometimes 2. And I felt so small. I felt so unequipped. I said, dang, is that what I'm supposed to be doing as a pastor? Like, I'm like, he sees something. He's experiencing something. He's enjoying God in a way, and I'm just missing that. I'm just struggling with that. Have you ever felt like that? Like God is doing something clearly in everybody else's life around you, and you're sitting there thinking, man, I'm struggling to hold on. I'm struggling to keep it going. So that's not the first thing. That's the first thing that John shows us. He shows that when that doubt grows, when we can't see enough, and that sets us up for the beauty of what comes next. Because if that is our struggle, then the question comes, what does God do with people like that? And then John shows us something different. Or the second observation is that John is not threatened by our doubts. I think some people really need to hear that. Let's look at real quick at the conversation. Pick it back up at verse 26, and it says 8 days later, which in their time and their language, that just simply meant a week. We would say 7 days later, but they would say 8 days later, his disciples were inside again. So Thomas was still with his disciples for this whole week, and they're trying to convince him. They're ready to worship Jesus, and Thomas is just struggling, but he's still committed. And that's important for you to know that because you may be struggling. And it's okay for you to stay connected to other people who aren't struggling in their faith. It's okay for you to still be coming to the house of prayer, even though you may be uncertain. So that's what Thomas did. He stayed in their place. And then it says that although the doors were locked again, it's highlighted that the doors were locked. Jesus came and stood among them, and that what Thomas missed, Jesus gives to him. He says, peace be unto you. And then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands, and put your hand and place it in my side. And then he says something else. Do not disbelieve, but believe. And that's right there. We could stop because that's already good news. Because Jesus comes back a week later just to meet Thomas. He does not write Thomas off because Thomas is struggling. He does not write Thomas off because Thomas has questions and Thomas has doubts and Thomas needs more evidence. He does not move on. He does not shame Thomas for missing a moment. He comes again to meet him there. He comes into the same room. The doors are still locked. The fear is still locked. The fear is still there. The questions are still there. And Jesus steps into that space and he says, Shalom. He says, peace be with you. And then he turns directly to Thomas. That's amazing. He comes into this place. He turns directly to Thomas and he gives him the instructions. Because Jesus, if we notice what Jesus is doing, he isn't threatened by Thomas's doubts. He's not scared of Thomas's questions. He isn't fragile and believe that, he can't hold up to this level of critique. Jesus meets Thomas right there in the point of his struggle, and he shows Thomas his own scars. He's demonstrating to Thomas, he's demonstrating to us all that Jesus, he is vulnerable. See, sometimes we read this and we read a critique. Right? Because in our mind, that's just what we believe. We believe God is ready to get us every time we make a mistake. Every time we veer off, we believe God is there to correct us with a heavy hand. But that's not what Jesus is doing. This is a personal meeting that Jesus makes just to come and comfort one of his friends. And the same thing Thomas said. Thomas told them, I don't care what y'all say. I ain't gonna never believe unless I can place my finger, unless I can see for myself, unless I can place my hands. And notice, Jesus answers Thomas's prayer exactly. That everything that Thomas asked for, Jesus offers him. He says to him, put your finger here. Thomas says, unless I touch it, he says, put your finger here. Thomas says, I don't care what y'all say, I got to see it with my own eyes. And Jesus said, and see my hands, showing him his scars. Put your hand here, showing him his wounds. Jesus is coming right there where he is. And that matters because some of us have quietly assumed this, especially since church folk have condemned you. They've condemned you for struggling. They've condemned you for doubts. They've condemned you for questions. When I was a kid, they would tell me, any question that I brought, they would tell me, don't question. Y'all heard it too. Right? But notice, that's not what Thomas is doing. We think if we ask too many questions, maybe the people will know what I don't know. And so I pretend that I know. I pretend I get it, but I don't. If I ask too many questions, maybe I'm disqualifying myself as a believer. But we need to know that's not how Jesus responds to our doubts. That's not how Jesus responds to our struggles. Jesus isn't tired of us because we are struggling oftentimes to believe. And there's this famous woman, pastor and writer, very, very thoughtful, very good, gifted. Her name is Barbara Brown Taylor. And she says this. She says, if you are in the dark, it does not mean that you have taken some terrible misstep. She admits this. She says, for many years, I thought my questions and my doubt and my sense of absence were all signs of my lack of faith. But now I know this is the life of how the Spirit goes. And this is helpful for us because it helps us with this scene. Thomas is in the dark. Thomas, he's questioning. Thomas feels the absence because they've got something that he just don't have. And Jesus isn't threatened by that. He comes back there and he meets him there. And I want you to know that he is willing to meet you in your doubts, meet you where you're struggling as well. That don't mean that Jesus wants us to remain in unbelief. It does mean that he is patient with strugglers. And maybe that's the message, that's the word that somebody needs to hear today. Your questions are still here. You still don't feel certain. But you need to know that your doubts and your questions, that Jesus isn't threatened by those. He is not threatened by your honest doubt. He can handle your questions, your hesitations, and he can handle the places where your faith feels weak. And that leads us to this final point of this part of the story. And John shows us this. He shows us that Jesus, he transformed doubters and he invites us to follow him. This is something else we see, and it goes right next in that next verse, in verse 28. After Jesus had come to Thomas, after Jesus met him in his doubt, met him in his struggling, and hear how Thomas responds to that in verse 28. Thomas answered him, and he said this. He said, "My Lord, my God." And so, so one of the best ways for us to translate that, because in the original language, we kind of miss it. Sometimes we go over so quickly. In the original, this is what it actually, sometimes this is what this means. It means that you are the one who rules over me, my Lord. You are the one who rules over me, my God, and you are the God whom I worship. So what Thomas is saying in that moment is that, hey, you are not just the Lord, or you're not just my Savior, but you are the one that I'm submitting to as Lord over my life in every area, in every arena. You, Lord, can speak into my future. You, Lord, can speak into my sex life. You, Lord, can speak into the way I manage money. You, Lord, can speak into the way I view politics. You, Lord, are able to speak into all of my doubts. You are the one, Lord, who can speak to the way I treat others, both privately and publicly. When he says, my Lord and my God, he is saying that you are in control and you are the one that I will worship. And that's the transformation we all want. Thomas isn't left in his skepticism. Jesus meets him and Jesus moves him. And that's important because Jesus transforms us. He don't leave us in our doubt, but he transforms us so that we can see and we can follow him faithfully, but yet imperfectly. Jesus welcomes our doubts in order to take us somewhere else, toward trust, toward surrender, toward confession, toward worship. This is what Jesus was saying when he said, those who worship me must worship me in spirit and in truth. But Jesus don't stop there either. In verse 29, Jesus says something else. Jesus says to him, have you believed because you have seen me? This is a question. And then he says something else, this is really good news for us. He says, blessed are those who have not seen yet have believed. And so a lot of times the way we've been taught that, or the way we misread that, we're pretending like Thomas is all by himself. Like, oh, Thomas needed something extra. That's just not true. Thomas just wasn't there and he missed the moment. The disciples didn't believe blindly. They believed because they saw Jesus. Right? They witnessed him. They saw him. So when he's saying that, that's not a critique. That's good news. What he is saying is, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed, because I know who he was thinking about when he said that. He was thinking about me. He was thinking about you, because I didn't see the resurrection. You didn't see the resurrection. And everybody else who came after this didn't see the resurrection. And so he's saying, hey, blessed are those who are coming after you, those who I'm sending you to as messengers of hope, because they will believe and they won't have enough evidence to satisfy their doubts. And so I'm here to encourage you today that as John shows us these three things, he shows us that doubt grows when we can't see enough. He shows us that Jesus isn't threatened by our doubts. He shows us that Jesus transforms doubters and he invites us to follow him. But we also got to be honest about the struggle that still will remain. One thing that Jesus met Thomas, it's a whole other thing that Jesus still meet people like that today. And so It's fair to ask, what about when I still have questions? What about when I still have doubts? What about when I still can't see? What about when I still don't feel? And what about when I'm still unsure? And that's why this matters, because Jesus is showing us the type of Jesus we're dealing with. He's showing us that he is a safe space for those who are skeptical and those who are struggling. He welcomes our doubts, invites us to trust him. So maybe, just maybe, the invitation for you today is not that you pretend that all your questions are gone, not that you pretend that you believe with complete certainty. Maybe Jesus is inviting you to honestly bring your questions and your doubts, knowing that he won't leave you where you are. But the same Jesus that transformed Thomas is the same Jesus at work transforming our lives today. And that is what brings us, for those in the room who considers ourselves to be followers of Jesus,